He believed he had witnessed every kind of pain money could never erase. Until the morning he accidentally saw the scars hidden beneath the sleeves of the quiet woman who cleaned his home. Dominic Castellano rarely noticed the staff moving through his mansion. That was never because he considered them unimportant. It was because everyone who worked for him had mastered the art of becoming invisible. Shoes made no sound against polished oak floors. Doors opened and closed like whispers. Breakfast appeared before sunrise. Coffee stayed warm without anyone seeing who replaced it. It was a rhythm built on discipline, respect, and distance. Yet there was one person whose silence somehow lingered longer than the rest. Naomi Carter had worked at the estate for almost 4 months, and if someone asked Dominic to describe her, he would have struggled. She was always punctual, always composed, always dressed in simple dark uniforms with long sleeves. Even during the hottest days of July when Chicago humidity settled over the city like a heavy blanket. She never complained, never asked for favors, never accepted praise for the smallest kindness she quietly offered everyone around her. The gardeners found fresh lemonade waiting beside them during long afternoons. The elderly cook always discovered the heavier boxes had somehow already been carried into storage before she arrived. Even Dominic's security team, men who trusted almost no one, admitted that Naomi had an unusual way of making difficult days feel lighter without ever asking for attention. It was almost as if she believed the greatest kindness should never expect to be noticed. That morning had begun like every other. The mansion overlooked Lake Michigan, where pale sunlight reflected across the calm water, painting silver lines through enormous windows. Dominic had canceled 3 meetings after another restless night and decided to work from the library instead of his office. The mansion remained unusually quiet. Somewhere upstairs, a vacuum cleaner hummed for only a few seconds before falling silent again. He barely looked up from the documents spread across the mahogany desk until he realized someone had entered the adjoining reading room. Naomi believed the library was empty. She carried a folded stack of fresh linens against her chest before gently placing them on a nearby chair. Her movements remained careful, almost rehearsed. Then she paused. She glanced toward the closed hallway door. Listened. Waited. Certain no one else was nearby, she slowly rolled one sleeve above her forearm. Dominic never intended to watch. He should have announced himself immediately. Instead, something about the hesitation in her movements held him perfectly still. Naomi reached into a small first aid pouch hidden beneath the folded towels. She quietly replaced a clean bandage wrapped around her arm with practiced precision. There was no panic, no frustration, only remarkable patience. As the fabric slipped slightly farther, morning light revealed pale scars crossing her skin in delicate patterns unlike anything Dominic had ever seen. They were old, completely healed, countless, not the mark of one terrible day, but the silent record of many forgotten tomorrows. Naomi quickly lowered her sleeve again, carefully smoothing every wrinkle until nothing remained visible. She closed the pouch, collected the linens, and turned toward the hallway. For the briefest second, her eyes met Dominic's. Time stopped. Neither of them spoke. Naomi's expression carried no embarrassment, only quiet disappointment, as though the one thing she had spent years protecting had finally been discovered. Dominic watched her disappear into the corridor without saying a single word. The mansion returned to silence, but nothing inside it felt the same. For the first time since Naomi Carter entered his home, Dominic Castellano realized he knew absolutely nothing about the woman everyone believed was simply the maid. Dominic spent the rest of the morning pretending to read reports that suddenly seemed unimportant. Numbers blurred together. Business proposals waited for signatures that never came. Every few minutes his thoughts drifted back to the same quiet image of Naomi standing alone in the reading room with calm hands and eyes that carried no self-pity. What unsettled him was not the existence of the scars. His world had introduced him to countless people marked by difficult lives. What troubled him was the way she had hidden them so naturally, as though protecting everyone else from asking questions mattered more than anyone knowing her truth. By lunchtime, he found himself doing something he had never done before. He asked the head housekeeper about one of the employees. Sophia looked genuinely surprised. During 8 years of managing the estate, Dominic had never requested personal details about anyone on the domestic staff. She answered carefully, assuming there must be a practical reason behind the question. Naomi Carter arrived 4 months earlier through a respected employment agency. Excellent references. Perfect attendance. No disciplinary issues. She never missed a shift. She volunteered whenever another employee became sick. She requested the smallest room in the staff residence, even though larger accommodations were available. She donated part of every paycheck to a local community charity without placing her name on any public record. Sophia smiled softly before adding something that lingered in Dominic's thoughts long after their conversation ended. Everyone likes her, Mr. Castellano, but none of us really know her. She listens more than she speaks. Dominic thanked her and dismissed the matter, yet curiosity refused to disappear. Throughout the afternoon, he noticed details that had escaped him for months. Naomi always carried boxes with both hands, even when lighter items could be balanced against one shoulder. She never accepted help climbing the staircase with folded laundry. She quietly stepped aside whenever anyone moved too quickly through narrow hallways, almost as if sudden movements made her instinctively cautious. During dinner preparations, one of the younger kitchen assistants accidentally dropped an entire tray of fresh bread onto the floor. The young man looked devastated, apologizing over and over before anyone could even react. Naomi simply knelt beside him with a warm smile, helped gather everything that could still be saved, and gently told him that one mistake never defined a good person. Her voice remained so calm that the embarrassment disappeared from his face within seconds. Dominic watched from the opposite end of the hallway without making his presence known. There was something unusual about her kindness. It never sounded rehearsed. It carried the quiet confidence of someone who understood exactly how heavy regret could feel. Later that evening, rain began falling across the city. Most of the staff hurried indoors after finishing their duties, but Naomi remained outside beneath the covered garden walkway, carefully adjusting a small wooden bird feeder that had tilted during the afternoon wind. She stood there for several minutes, watching tiny sparrows return one by one despite the weather. There was peace in her expression that Dominic had not seen inside the mansion. It was almost as though caring for fragile things came as naturally to her as breathing. As she finally turned toward the house, a sudden gust lifted one sleeve just enough for him to notice the edge of another faded scar near her wrist before she calmly pulled the fabric back into place. She never looked around to see whether anyone had noticed. She simply continued walking through the rain with the same quiet dignity she carried everywhere else. Dominic remained standing beneath the stone archway long after she disappeared inside. The questions multiplying in his mind no longer felt like ordinary curiosity. They felt like the beginning of a story that someone had spent years making certain the world would never hear. The following morning, the mansion returned to its familiar rhythm, but Dominic could no longer move through it with the comfortable certainty he once had. Every polished hallway seemed to hold unanswered questions. Every quiet footstep reminded him that someone had been carrying an invisible history only a few feet away from him for months. He told himself to let it go. Every employee deserved privacy. Yet something deep inside him refused to believe Naomi's silence came from ordinary caution. It felt more like someone who had learned that surviving often depended on never becoming memorable. After breakfast, Dominic called Vincent, the head of his security team, into the study. Vincent had served beside him for more than a decade and understood the difference between curiosity and genuine concern. Dominic handed him Naomi's employment file without offering an explanation. Vincent reviewed the paperwork for several minutes before looking up. Everything checks out. Background verification is clean. No criminal record. Credit history is almost non-existent. Employment references are legitimate. She moved several times over the past 5 years, but nothing unusual stands out. Dominic remained quiet before asking a question that surprised even himself. What is missing? Vincent frowned. Missing? People always leave footprints, especially over several years. Friends, family, social media, community groups, something. Naomi has almost none of it. It is as though she intentionally erased herself without actually disappearing. Vincent leaned back in his chair, clearly unsettled by his own observation. I have investigated hundreds of people, Mr. Castellano. Usually I discover too much. With her, I cannot find enough. Dominic dismissed him with a simple nod, but the conversation lingered throughout the day. That afternoon, the estate prepared for a charity reception scheduled later in the week. Florists arrived with dozens of white lilies. Delivery trucks rolled through the front gates carrying tables, crystal glassware, and fresh decorations. Naomi quietly moved among the organized chaos, helping everyone without ever placing herself at the center of attention. She noticed a young florist struggling to reach the highest branches of an arrangement and silently steadied the ladder until the work was finished. When one of the older maintenance workers rubbed his aching shoulder after lifting heavy crates, Naomi disappeared into the kitchen and returned with a warm towel without saying a word. She seemed to anticipate other people's needs before they spoke them aloud. Watching from the balcony above, Dominic realized something remarkable. Naomi never behaved as though kindness earned recognition. She offered it with the quiet certainty of someone repaying a debt only she understood. Late that evening, the mansion finally settled into silence again. Dominic crossed the eastern hallway on his way back to the library when he noticed a soft light beneath the partially open laundry room door. Inside, Naomi stood alone, carefully folding freshly pressed linens into perfect stacks. An old radio rested on the shelf beside her, barely loud enough to hear a gentle piano melody drifting through the room. She believed she was completely alone. After finishing the final stack, she reached into the pocket of her apron and removed a small folded photograph. Dominic could not see the faces from where he stood, only the tenderness with which she brushed a thumb across the worn edges before quietly placing the picture back inside her pocket. Then, almost without thinking, she whispered four simple words that barely rose above the music. "I hope you are safe." Dominic stepped back before she could notice him, his heartbeat strangely heavier than before. Those words were not spoken to someone who had been forgotten. They were spoken to someone she still believed was waiting somewhere beyond her reach. For the first time, Dominic understood that Naomi was not hiding from her past alone. She was protecting something precious that the past had never managed to take away. 2 days later, the mansion buzzed with quiet preparation as guests from across Chicago's business community began arriving for the annual charity reception. Luxury sedans rolled through the iron gates one after another, their polished surfaces reflecting the afternoon sun, while security officers guided every vehicle with practiced precision. Inside, the staff moved with perfect coordination, placing floral arrangements, adjusting crystal glasses, and making certain every detail reflected the elegance expected inside the Castellano estate. Naomi worked exactly as she always did, unnoticed by nearly everyone except the man who had recently begun noticing everything. Dominic found himself watching her from across crowded rooms without fully understanding why. She smiled politely whenever spoken to, yet there was always a careful distance in her eyes, as though an invisible line separated her from the rest of the world. She never crossed that line, and she never invited anyone else across it either. The reception had barely begun when Vincent quietly approached Dominic near the grand staircase. His expression remained calm, but something in his posture suggested concern. "There is someone outside the main gate who has been here twice this week," he said softly. "He has not attempted to enter. He simply parks across the street for several minutes before leaving." Dominic glanced through the tall front windows toward the distant entrance where a dark gray sedan sat beneath a row of maple trees. From that distance, the driver was impossible to identify. "Another visitor?" Dominic asked. Vincent slowly shook his head. "Not according to our guest list. We have already checked the license plate. It belongs to a rental company. Nothing illegal. Nothing that gives us a reason to intervene." Dominic nodded, expecting the conversation to end there, until his eyes drifted across the entrance hall. Naomi had just stepped outside carrying a small basket of fresh flowers for the front porch. The moment her gaze lifted toward the street, every trace of color disappeared from her face. She froze so completely that even the flowers slipped slightly in her hands. It lasted only a heartbeat before she lowered her eyes, steadied her breathing, and calmly continued walking as though nothing had happened. To everyone else, she looked perfectly composed. Dominic was the only person who noticed that her hands trembled just enough to make one white rose fall onto the stone steps. She immediately bent to retrieve it, taking longer than necessary before standing again. When she returned inside, she quietly excused herself from the entrance hall and disappeared toward the service corridor without speaking to anyone. Dominic waited only a few seconds before following at a respectful distance. He found her in the small pantry beside the kitchen, standing near an open window with both hands resting lightly against the counter. Her breathing was slow, deliberate, almost as though she was reminding herself that she was safe. She never cried. She never panicked. She simply closed her eyes for a brief moment before whispering words that barely carried across the room. Not here. Please not here. Before Dominic could decide whether to step forward, Naomi opened her eyes, straightened her uniform, and returned to work wearing the same gentle expression everyone expected from her. It was as though the frightened woman had vanished in the space of a single breath. That evening, after the final guests departed and the mansion settled into silence once again, Dominic stood alone in his study staring toward the front gate visible through the distant windows. The gray sedan was gone, but the image of Naomi standing motionless with quiet fear remained fixed in his mind. For the first time, he stopped asking what had happened to her years ago. A different question had quietly taken its place. Whatever she had escaped, had it truly ever stopped searching for her? The next morning began beneath a blanket of gray clouds that softened the light spilling across Lake Michigan. The mansion felt quieter than usual, as though even the walls sensed the questions Dominic could no longer ignore. Shortly after sunrise, he found Naomi arranging fresh flowers in the breakfast room, carefully trimming each stem with steady hands. She looked exactly as she always had, calm, polite, almost impossible to disturb. If he had not witnessed the fear in her eyes the previous afternoon, he might have convinced himself he had imagined everything. Instead, he walked into the room carrying 2 cups of coffee and gently placed one on the table beside her. Naomi looked surprised. During the months she had worked there, Dominic had never interrupted her duties without a practical reason. She thanked him quietly, but made no move to sit. Dominic did not begin with questions. He simply stood beside the window overlooking the gardens until the silence became comfortable instead of awkward. Finally, he spoke in the same measured voice he used when negotiating impossible situations. "You do not have to tell me anything you do not wish to share." Naomi lowered her eyes toward the untouched coffee. For several moments, she said nothing. Then she asked a question of her own. "Have you ever looked at someone and believed you already knew their story?" Dominic answered honestly. "More times than I care to admit." Naomi gave a faint smile that carried no bitterness, only quiet understanding. "Most people see these uniforms and assume my hardest days began when I started cleaning other people's homes. The truth is exactly the opposite." She slowly rolled one sleeve just enough to reveal a single faded scar near her wrist before resting her hand gently against the table. This one came from climbing over an old chain-link fence while helping 2 frightened children leave a place where they should never have been. They made it safely to a shelter. I kept the scar instead. Her fingers lightly traced another faint mark farther up her arm. This one happened while carrying my younger cousin through the woods after a hurricane destroyed our neighborhood. He cried because he thought he was slowing me down. I told him heroes were never in a hurry. Today he is studying engineering in Atlanta. Dominic remained perfectly still. Naomi was not asking for sympathy. She spoke with the peaceful gratitude of someone remembering people she loved. She gently touched the edge of another scar that disappeared beneath her sleeve. Years ago, an elderly woman collapsed outside a community center during the middle of winter. Everyone was afraid they might make things worse by moving her. I stayed with her until help arrived. She survived. Every Christmas, she still sends me a handwritten card, even though I have never told her where I live now. Naomi looked out toward the garden where birds gathered around the wooden feeder she faithfully filled each evening. "Every mark has a face attached to it," she whispered. "Every scar reminds me that someone else was able to keep living their life. That is why I never tried to erase them. I only learned to hide them because people stop seeing who you are once they begin counting the marks instead." Dominic felt something inside him quietly shift. For years he had measured strength through influence, discipline, and control. Standing beside Naomi, he realized genuine courage often looked nothing like power. Sometimes it looked like choosing kindness again and again without expecting the world to remember. Before either of them could speak another word, Vincent appeared in the doorway with unusual urgency. He apologized for interrupting, but his expression carried news that immediately changed the atmosphere. "Mr. Castellano, the gray sedan is back. This time it has not stopped outside the gate. It is parked directly across the street, and the driver has been watching the mansion for over an hour." Naomi slowly closed her eyes for one brief second before opening them again with remarkable composure. Dominic noticed it immediately. She had expected this day to come. Vincent waited until Naomi quietly excused herself before speaking again. The breakfast room felt different after she left, as though her absence had carried away the warmth that had filled it only moments before. Dominic walked toward the tall windows overlooking the front entrance. Beyond the stone walls and iron gates, the gray sedan remained exactly where Vincent had described, perfectly still beneath the cloudy morning sky. Whoever occupied the vehicle possessed remarkable patience. They were not creating a disturbance. They were simply waiting. Dominic had spent most of his adult life recognizing the difference. Waiting often revealed more determination than confrontation ever could. Vincent folded his hands behind his back. We can ask local law enforcement to investigate, but there is still no legal reason to remove the vehicle. They have not crossed the property line or threatened anyone. Dominic remained silent for several seconds before answering. Then we will not react with fear. We will react with preparation. Increase security around the staff entrances. Make it look routine. I do not want anyone frightened, especially Naomi. Vincent nodded and immediately left to organize the adjustments without raising unnecessary attention. Throughout the day, the estate continued operating normally, at least on the surface. Deliveries arrived on schedule. Gardeners trimmed the hedges surrounding the fountain. Housekeepers polished marble floors until they reflected the chandeliers above like still water. Yet Dominic noticed something remarkable. Naomi behaved exactly as she always had. She smiled warmly at the elderly cook while helping prepare lunch. She folded fresh towels with the same precise care. She paused outside to refill the wooden bird feeder despite the chilly breeze drifting in from the lake. Anyone watching casually would believe nothing had changed. Only Dominic recognized the quiet discipline hidden beneath her calm expression. She was not pretending everything was normal because she was fearless. She was protecting everyone else from carrying the weight she had already accepted herself. Late that afternoon, Dominic found her standing alone in the greenhouse where sunlight filtered through tall glass panels, casting gentle patterns across rows of blooming orchids. The room smelled of fresh soil and jasmine. Naomi carefully removed a yellow leaf from one of the smaller plants before noticing him approaching. She offered the same respectful smile she always did. I hope I am not neglecting my duties, sir. Dominic slowly shook his head. You have never neglected anything since the day you arrived. Naomi lowered her eyes with quiet humility. That compliment seemed to make her more uncomfortable than criticism ever could. Dominic studied the flowers surrounding them before speaking again. Earlier today, you told me every scar had someone else's face attached to it. I have been thinking about that ever since. Naomi gently touched one of the orchid blossoms with remarkable tenderness. Flowers bloom again after difficult seasons because they never waste energy asking why the storm came. They simply use whatever sunlight returns. I try to live the same way. Dominic looked at her for a long moment. In boardrooms filled with powerful executives, he had heard thousands of carefully crafted speeches about leadership, resilience, and success. None of them carried the quiet truth contained within that single sentence. For the first time in many years, he found himself questioning the foundation upon which he had measured strength. He had built an empire through discipline and control. Naomi had built peace inside herself through compassion that refused to disappear, even after life had given her every excuse to become bitter. As evening settled across the estate, Vincent returned with another update. The gray sedan had finally driven away shortly before sunset. Security cameras recorded its departure, but the driver never stepped outside. Dominic expected relief. Instead, an unfamiliar feeling settled over him. The vehicle had left too quietly, without answers, without closure. Standing beside the greenhouse windows, he watched Naomi continue caring for the smallest plants with patient hands, completely unaware that she had already changed something far greater than the atmosphere inside his home. She had quietly changed the heart of the man who owned it. 3 quiet days passed without another sign of the mysterious sedan, and life inside the Castellano estate slowly returned to its familiar rhythm. Even so, Dominic noticed that his security team remained more attentive than before, their eyes lingering a little longer at the front gate whenever unfamiliar vehicles approached. He appreciated their caution, but his attention stayed fixed on someone else entirely. Naomi continued living exactly as she always had. She greeted every employee by name. She remembered birthdays no one else celebrated. She left handwritten notes beside fresh meals whenever a member of the staff worked late into the evening. It seemed impossible that a woman carrying so much hidden history could still notice the smallest needs of everyone around her. One crisp Saturday afternoon, Dominic attended a private business meeting in one of his downtown office buildings. Several longtime associates joined him around a polished conference table overlooking the Chicago skyline. The discussion centered on charity investments, community redevelopment, and future partnerships rather than profits alone. During a short break, one of the older guests glanced through the floor-to-ceiling windows and quietly froze. Across the street, near a small neighborhood park, stood Naomi. She had finished her shift early and was still wearing a simple sweater over her work clothes. In her hands, she carried several paper bags filled with groceries. Dominic watched with quiet curiosity as she crossed the sidewalk toward a group of children gathered near a playground. The children immediately ran toward her with joyful smiles, calling her Miss Naomi before surrounding her in cheerful conversation. She greeted every one of them by name, handing each child a sandwich, fresh fruit, and small storybooks from the bags she had carried herself. Nearby, an elderly pastor stepped outside the modest brick community center and warmly thanked her for coming again. Dominic asked Vincent, who had accompanied him, whether he knew anything about the place. Vincent made a quick phone call before quietly answering. It is a volunteer center for families rebuilding their lives after difficult circumstances. According to the director, Naomi has been coming here almost every weekend for years. She never asks for recognition. She refuses photographs for fundraising campaigns. Most donors do not even know her name. Before Dominic could respond, another black sedan slowly rolled to the curb across the street. Two well-dressed men stepped out and paused near the entrance of the community center. Vincent instinctively tensed, but something unexpected happened. Instead of approaching Naomi directly, the men spoke briefly with the elderly pastor, who quietly handed one of them a thin envelope. The taller man opened it, removed several old photographs, and stood completely still. His confident expression slowly disappeared. He passed the photographs to his companion without saying a word. Both men looked across the street toward Naomi, who was kneeling beside a little girl, helping her tie the lace on a worn sneaker before brushing a strand of hair away from the child's face with gentle care. The taller man lowered the photographs and slowly shook his head. Even from a distance, Dominic could see genuine disbelief on his face. After a long silence, the man, quietly, said something Vincent managed to hear through a directional microphone carried by security. "That cannot be her. The file described someone completely different." The pastor answered with calm certainty. People often mistake scars for weakness because they never learn the stories behind them. The two visitors remained motionless for another moment before carefully placing the photographs back inside the envelope. Without another word, they returned to their vehicle and drove away. They had arrived expecting to find one person and left realizing they had misunderstood everything. Dominic never learned exactly what those photographs revealed, but he no longer needed proof that Naomi's past carried extraordinary weight. Watching children laugh around the woman the world had overlooked, he understood something far more important. The quietest soul in his life had earned a respect that even strangers could not deny once they finally saw the truth. When Dominic returned to the estate that evening, the city lights shimmered across Lake Michigan like scattered stars, but his thoughts remained fixed on the small community center and the quiet woman who had once again revealed a side of herself without ever trying to impress anyone. He had spent years building influence through careful decisions, yet Naomi had earned the respect of complete strangers simply by living according to principles that never changed. The realization stayed with him long after the mansion fell silent. Early the next morning, he invited Vincent into the study once more. There was no urgency in his voice, only unusual clarity. "I want to know who has been watching her," he said. "Not so we can punish them. I want to understand why they believed she deserved to be followed in the first place." Vincent nodded before placing a thin folder on the desk. "We finally found a connection. The people in the gray sedan were not looking for revenge. They were searching for confirmation. Several years ago, a nonprofit organization documented stories of ordinary citizens who quietly helped families rebuild their lives after natural disasters, housing crises, and community emergencies. Naomi refused every interview, every photograph, and every public award. The only records that remained were handwritten statements from the people she had helped. Dominic slowly opened the folder. Inside were simple letters rather than official reports. One thanked an unnamed young woman for helping reunite relatives after a devastating storm. Another described someone who spent weeks organizing meals for elderly neighbors without accepting a single dollar. Another letter came from a school principal who wrote that one volunteer had purchased winter coats for children using money saved from working extra cleaning jobs. None of the letters mentioned scars. None described dramatic heroics. They spoke only about consistent kindness offered without expectation. Vincent quietly continued. The men outside the community center represented a private foundation that verifies stories before creating scholarship programs. They believed the stories had been exaggerated because they seemed impossible for one person. Yesterday, the pastor showed them evidence collected over many years. They left without asking another question. Dominic closed the folder with careful hands. Every page felt heavier than the last. He had spent years hearing people boast about generosity while making certain cameras were nearby. Naomi had spent years avoiding recognition, even when recognition might have made her own life easier. Later that afternoon, Dominic walked through the gardens until he found Naomi replacing fresh water in the small bird feeder beside the stone path. The autumn breeze carried golden leaves across the lawn, and for several moments neither of them spoke. Finally, Dominic stepped beside her. I understand now why you never wanted anyone counting your scars. Naomi smiled gently while watching a pair of sparrows land nearby. They were never the important part, she answered softly. People always think the hardest thing is surviving difficult moments. It is not. The hardest thing is refusing to let those moments decide the kind of person you become afterward. Dominic looked toward the birds pecking peacefully at the scattered seeds. I spent a long time believing strength meant protecting what belonged to me. Naomi shook her head with quiet kindness. Real strength protects people, even when they can never repay you. The words settled over the garden with the same quiet certainty as the falling leaves. Dominic realized there was nothing he could offer that would equal what Naomi had already given the world. Money could restore buildings. Influence could open doors. Power could solve countless problems. But none of those things could create a heart that chose compassion every single day. Standing beside the woman who still considered herself nothing more than a housekeeper, Dominic silently made one decision that would reshape the culture of his entire household. From that day forward, every person who entered his home would be treated with the same dignity Naomi had quietly shown to everyone else, because he finally understood that respect was never a privilege reserved for the powerful. It was a responsibility carried by those fortunate enough to recognize true character when it stood quietly beside them. Winter arrived quietly over the Castellano estate, covering the gardens with a delicate layer of frost that sparkled beneath the early morning sun. Months had passed since the questions surrounding Naomi had finally found their answers, yet very little about her daily routine had changed. She still arrived before sunrise. She still prepared fresh flowers for the breakfast room, greeted every employee with the same gentle smile, and filled the small wooden bird feeder before beginning her work. If someone had visited the mansion for the first time, they would have assumed she was simply another dedicated member of the household staff. Only those who lived there understood that something far greater had changed. It was not Naomi. It was everyone around her. New employees quickly noticed an unusual custom inside the estate. Every person, regardless of position or title, treated one another with quiet respect. Senior managers thanked kitchen assistants. Security officers carried supplies for the housekeeping staff without being asked. Gardeners were invited to share meals inside during cold afternoons instead of eating alone outside. No formal policy announced these changes. They simply became part of the culture because Dominic had chosen to lead by example. One morning, a young housekeeper nervously apologized after accidentally breaking an expensive porcelain vase that had belonged to Dominic's grandmother. The entire room fell silent, expecting disappointment. Dominic looked toward Naomi, who was already helping the young woman gather the scattered pieces with remarkable calm. He gently knelt beside them, thanked the employee for being honest, and quietly said, "Objects can be replaced. Integrity cannot." The young woman's eyes filled with grateful tears, while Naomi offered nothing more than her familiar peaceful smile. She understood that the lesson had finally taken root. Several weeks later, the community center invited Dominic to attend a small appreciation gathering for local volunteers. He accepted on one condition: no speeches would be given about him. The evening belonged to people whose kindness had quietly transformed lives without expecting recognition. When he entered the modest hall, framed photographs decorated one wall. They showed children graduating from school, families standing proudly in front of rebuilt homes, elderly neighbors celebrating birthdays surrounded by friends, and volunteers working side by side, without concern for who received credit. Near the center hung a single photograph Naomi had never known existed. She stood beneath a large oak tree handing a backpack to a smiling child while looking away from the camera, completely unaware that someone had captured the moment years earlier. Beneath the photograph appeared a simple sentence: "Sometimes the people who leave the deepest marks are the ones who never ask to be remembered." Dominic stood before those words for a long time. He realized the world often celebrated loud victories, while overlooking quiet faithfulness repeated day after day. As the gathering ended, the elderly pastor approached Naomi with a small wooden box. Inside rested dozens of handwritten notes collected over many years from people whose lives she had touched. She accepted the box with trembling hands and whispered that she had never expected anyone to save those memories. The pastor smiled warmly. Kindness never disappears. It simply waits for the right moment to remind people that goodness still exists. Driving back to the estate beneath a sky filled with winter stars, Dominic glanced toward Naomi, sitting peacefully in the passenger seat. She looked out the window, watching snowflakes drift through the headlights with the same quiet wonder she gave every ordinary moment. He finally understood that the scars she had hidden beneath long sleeves had never diminished her beauty or her dignity. They had become silent reminders that compassion always leaves a mark, even when the world cannot immediately see it. And from that day forward, everyone who entered the Castellano estate remembered that true strength was never measured by power, wealth, or reputation, but by the quiet courage to protect the dignity of others, because that was the day the world remembered what dignity truly looks like.